The Art of War is one of the most influential military books, and it's no surprise it's often referenced in RTS games, because no other genre puts such an emphasis on tactics and decision-making. However, I've come to a conclusion that there is a lot more lessons we can derive from economics and economic laws that can benefit your decision-making in such games. After all, a bigger and better army usually wins, most of the time. So let's start with the most important and basic theory – opportunity costs. To put it simply, every time you make a decision, you always operate within the frame of limited resources, whether in-game or in real life. Every choice you make means you have to sacrifice the alternative. Sometimes the alternative could be simply measured, but sometimes it's much more complicated. Let's take StarCraft 2 as an example. Every time you opt for a certain technology path, you have to sacrifice other tech options, which restricts your playstyle. If you decide to play SkyToss, you cannot simply transition to ground units easily, and you cannot build both at the same time. Each path opens different units and moves in the game, and this concept is very easy to grasp. However, it gets a bit more tricky when you try to predict the consequences of such choices. The alternative cost will vary quite a lot depending on what your opponent does and how he reacts to your actions. It's not only about unit or technology price, but also how it actually performs on the battlefield. A stack of Mutalisks, for example, can become deadly and turn the whole game in your favor, but you can also easily lose them with one mistake. Some units or structures can improve your situation in the short term, but degrade your capabilities in the future. As a very obvious example, building static defense significantly improves your defensive positions, but it also severely limits your resources that could be spent on the army. Hence, this is the sacrifice you have to make. This is especially true for the majority of in-game economy choices, specifically for Zerg race. Every time you use your larva for something else, you miss the ability to build more drones. And more drones means faster growth of economy and even more army units in the near future. As strange as it sounds, sometimes 10 Zerlings cost you 40 Zerlings in the future. Additionally, making upgrades also contributes to choices and alternative costs. If you have invested a lot of resources into mech upgrades, you are much less likely to switch to bio, because now you have much larger sunken costs. The lesson from that economy law is simple: you need to realize that every spending in this game means you're sacrificing something else. When you understand that, you'll realize how valuable each unit is, and why you should be careful with overspending on defense. That's the most common mistake for players below Master and Grandmaster League. I also cover that in my full guide to Grandmaster League. Marginal utility represents the change of utility or satisfaction for each extra piece of goods or services. For example, the first piece of chocolate you try might be amazing, the second one is also good, but after a couple of pieces the chocolate loses its attractiveness, and you are no longer craving it, and if you consume more, it might even make you sick, which means that the utility has shifted from positive to negative. In some way, the same principle applies to army composition in RTS games. For example, if you add one infestor to your army, it greatly increases the power of your army composition. The second and maybe the third infestor still contributes to it, but the more you add, the less value each new infestor holds, and it even becomes harmful, because of alternative costs and alternative army choices you could have made instead of building more infestors. This is specifically true for units who have limited applicability. You cannot really stack fungal growth, healing from medevacs, or side storms from High Templars. Hence, as soon as you have enough units or mana to cover the whole battlefield, adding extra casters becomes a waste of resources. While technically each unit should be adding some utility to your army, it's no longer the case if you have army supply, which is the case for almost every RTS game except for Command & Conquer series, Supreme Commander, and maybe some others. This means that, while theoretically each extra unit gives you value, in practice the wrong army composition could be very detrimental to you, which again returns us to the law of opportunity costs. This is why you never see pro players building more than a couple of casters, for example 2-3 Vipers or Infestors. While there is still the risk of losing them all, it's still a better decision than adding units which bring less and less value. Additionally, units in RTS games don't fight in an open field, at least not all the time. There is different terrain and your army composition is not always operating at its fullest potential. As an example, you can take a Roach army. Its utility changes drastically depending on the terrain they are fighting on. If you are fighting in a choke point, even the 200 supply of roaches might be useless. This is somewhat similar to the law of diminishing returns, which states that increasing one production factor without the changes of others might not cause any positive returns and even add negatives. And this is why many unit types have soft cap and you shouldn't really overbuild them even if there is still some increasing value. It's just better to adjust the terrain and game conditions. The same is true for an expanding economy. In StarCraft 2, there is no single conclusion on how many workers you should have in the late game, because numbers vary from 80 till even 100. However, with each worker after 80, you gain less and less value, since at this point your army starts shrinking in size and there's just so much you can do with additional resources. Hence, increasing your economy no longer improves your position in the game as much as it did when you had less bases and workers. That's it for today. While these laws might seem very obvious, it's really useful to keep them in mind to be more conscious while playing. It just helps with good decision making. If you enjoyed this video, check out my full guide to Grandmaster League. See you next time.